Good evening. I'm Stephanie Skestis Gabriel, the president of the Society for Contemporary Art, and I'd like to welcome all of our members and guests to this very special program. Tonight, Elizabeth Price is here from London. She's been at the Art Institute for several days, overseeing the installation of one of her video works that was recently acquired by the museum. It is now on view in the Donna and Howard Stone Gallery on the ground floor of the Modern Wing. A second video, also in the Art Institute's collection, will be on view in December until January 7th of next year. Before the artist takes the stage, I'd like to remind you that on October 30th, we will welcome New York-based painter Amy Sillman. Our programs are now free and open to the public, but registration is still required. I'd now like to welcome Vice President and Programming Co-Chair Jay Dandy, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening, and thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, everyone, for coming out on this lovely Chicago evening. If you have not already, could you please make sure your cell phones, two-way pagers, communication devices have been silenced. Tonight, we will be hearing from Elizabeth Price, whose videos manifest the drama of historical artifacts, archival images, and documentation through an institutional and feminist critique. Price lives and works in London. She has exhibited internationally at museums, including the Tate Modern in London, the New Museum, New York, and the Turku Art Museum in Finland. In 2012, Elizabeth was awarded the prestigious Turner Prize. Earlier this month, the Institute for Study of the Ancient World at New York University, in partnership with the Ashmolean Institute at Oxford, opened a trans-historical exhibition called Restoring the Minoans, Sir Arthur Evans and Elizabeth Price, inspired by Elizabeth's work, A Restoration. Price will also premiere a newly commissioned work made for the Walker Art Center as part of her upcoming exhibition there in 2018. Will you now join me in welcoming Elizabeth Price?
Good evening. First of all, I'd like to say that it's a real pleasure to be here in Chicago. I've never been to Chicago before, and I've spent a wonderful few days in the city, and I'm definitely going to come back. I've sort of fallen in love. I also need to say thanks to the Contemporary Art Society and the Institute for the incredible support manifest to me and my artistic practice in respect of purchasing the works for the collection, which is it's really wonderful to be part of the collection, but also, of course, it's a great support in enabling me to continue to make work, and I really appreciate it. Also, what is wonderful is the opportunity to present them so soon, which is really, really unusual. And so I'd really like to extend my thanks to Anne and all of the curatorial team in terms of presenting the work, and the technical job of it has been wonderful. I'm really happy with the presentation, and I'd also like to thank the technical team for that. Everybody has welcomed me so kindly and so generously. And so I've had a really wonderful time, and I just really want to express that before I begin. I'm going to talk for about 50 minutes, and during that time, I'm going to present some video clips, but the longest that they run for is 3 minutes, so you know where you are. It's always nice to know where you are with video. I'm going to offer a kind of introduction to my work, but talking through in a way its characteristics, how I make it. But in order to do that, I'm first going to offer an introduction by virtue of the first 20 seconds of the first video I made in 2006, which, for better or worse, still provides a good kind of introduction into the character and the formal elements of the works that I make. So this is from a public lecture, An Exhumation. videos I make are, I'm going to say they're narrative, I'm going to qualify that later on, but just for now, I'm going to say they're narrative, they tell stories. Those stories are usually communicated by a narrator that expresses themselves graphically, by an animated on-screen text. Sometimes that graphic expression is accompanied with an audio equivalent, usually a synthetic voice that speaks the words as they appear. And the graphic narrator declares themselves as a manifold voice. In a number of different ways, it reveals that it's not one person speaking, but some kind of group or body. In some instances, as in a public lecture and exhumation, it is the former committee of a library. In other instances, it may be the workforce of a museum or the backing singers in a girl group. And in every instance, this manifold narrator, as the former Libraries Committee have just done, invite you to enter into a kind of place, a jurisdiction, legal, institutional, a realm of ideas. They invite you to enter in. And in a sense, in every video, if they are dramas, the drama that occurs by virtue of this invitation. But I'm going to go on and kind of talk through and show you some clips. But before I show you any of the moving image clips, I just want to talk a little bit about the installation or the environment in which the work is shown. Because in every instance, the videos I make are intended to be encountered in an installation. This is partly so that I can control precisely the audiovisual aspects of the work. I aim to create a very intensive audiovisual environment. And of course, in terms of installation, I can determine the scale of the video projections, the location in relation to the seating, the sound of the scale of the volume, and its intensity in relation to the architecture. These things are formal elements that I can manipulate through the installation in the context of the piece in ways that are much, in a sense, are not possible within a kind of auditorium or cinema context. But also I design and realize sculptural elements. Although in every instance, these elements are normally the furnishing that allows the space to be a space for viewing. So at its most simple, it may be a bench or a chair, and its most complex, it may be an architectural intervention. But in every instance, the arrangement that is created in the literal site of the installation, the place where the viewer sits, a relationship is set up between that location and the figurative location proposed or constructed by the narrators in the course of the video. This is the installation from a film called The Tent, made in 2012, and this is the subject of that film, a book called Systems, which is a collection of manifestos of the British Systems Group, a group of artists working in the book is published in 1973, and they made abstract geometric art. And that book is the entire subject matter of that film. Okay, so I'm going to start now talking about, in a sense, the subject matters of the works more generally. I would say that the subject matter of my films is the material culture of the 20th century, which is quite big. But often I focus on artworks in specific collections or archives related to specific institutions, but certainly the art of the 20th century. Often I might refer to historic art, but generally this will be through the prism of the image-making technologies of the end of the 19th century and the 20th century. So I will look at historic art through archival photography. Often I will draw on numerous different kinds of documents of similar materials. So if I'm working in an archive, one will tend to find, or if I'm working with a collection, one will tend to find that a single artifact is reproduced numerous times. And one of the things I'm interested in is exploring the migration of an object or an artifact through a number of different kinds of representation at different moments for different purposes. The subject matter of my films is often documents themselves, and they will feature visually in the film, and also they are often extracted, ventriloquized, if you like, to produce the narration that I've already spoken about. Where I show photographs or documents that come from archives, I will tend to show them in archival contexts. One of the things I'm interested in is how images, and often I have a particular interest in specifically in how sculptural images will migrate through a series of different image-making technologies. And in a sense, each of those processes or each of those migrations will supplement the image. Artifacts will be generated which augment the original artifactual qualities of the originating image. So this is a wood carving of a 14th century Gothic church, the canopy over the Gothic choir. And this is, we're seeing it through the prism of a 19th century plate photography in a print made also in the 19th century, archived in the 20th century, residing in the National Monuments Archive, which is a public archive of photography of the built environment in Swindon in the UK, and where it was digitized by me in their reading room in 2011. And of course, one of the things in respect to the materials, the medium that I use, which is digital moving image, I'm interested also in the artifactual qualities of the digital, which sometimes we can forget about because they are our own moment and it's quite hard to see now, but which of course we are surrounded by. And in a sense, my own participation in the migration of these images is that the creation of the works that I make also participates in this kind of adaptation of the original materials through these series of technologies and contexts. I'm interested in where the materials come from, and I attempt to for that to be apparent or even drawn attention to in the context of the videos and their narratives, but also I would say I extend that. So here are two research images that supported the work, a restoration. This is a still from a restoration, which we'll be showing in the start of December. And here we see a recreation of a fresco commissioned by Arthur Evans following the excavation of Knossos, which is called the Prince of Lilies. And here we also see a larger illustration of the lily commissioned by Arthur Evans following that excavation. And this excavation is interesting and notorious insofar as the artistic license that Arthur Evans took in terms of interpreting the ancient culture of the Minoans. And certainly, when one looks at the Arthur Evans archive, one feels that one is seeing the start of the 20th century and the modernist languages of Art Deco and Art Nouveau much more kind of vitally than one is really seeing or finding a way to even see what could not be seen about the ancient culture of the Minoans. And anyhow, so I extrapolated the lily, the very stylized lily extrapolated by Arthur Evans. And in the course of a restoration, this lily is recreated by virtue of CGI animation so that it comes to enact a certain kind of unlifelike liveliness. And I often use CGI, but I would say that when I do it, I tend in a sense to use it to extrapolate some kind of material of the archive, but always in a way to remain within the logic and the material, or in a hallucinatory way, to remain within the location of the archive. So these flowers don't bloom as in organic life, they bloom with the kind of materiality and the sculptural potential of the materials of the archive. As I said, the subject matter of my work is, artworks, sculptures, photographs. And so these things are usually inanimate. But one of the things that happens in the course of my film is something like I described in relation to that CGI, that animation, that a kind of unlifelike liveliness is kind of enacted or extorted, maybe even from the artifacts. And So there is a kind of liveliness during the course of the film, which is one of my objectives in their composition, to create episodes of liveliness. But there is no actual direct human action. I don't ever point my camera at anyone, and although there are some clips where you do see moving image of people, these are archival materials. These are materials that I found in repositories where the materials are moving image rather than photography. But we do see some human action. We see my hands. So we see me demonstrating or enacting objects to the camera. And also, in respect of the kinds of materials I use, we continually see the image of the human body. And also, I think I'm going to show you a clip now from the film that I made in 2011 called A Tent, about the systems book, which I've already described. And I would say that one of the things that I attempt to compose in the film during the course of the edit, and now when I'm kind of creating the edit, is a kind of relation, a kind of choreography between the actions of me encountering, showing the book to myself, to the camera, to the viewer, and also kind of searching through the materials of the archive for images of human life, and in a sense trying to compose a choreography between the evidence of my own interaction with the book and the book's own evidence of its own agents. And so I'm just going to show you this clip. And that there, just at the end of that clip, was the start of the Buzzcocks' Boredom. And I often use pop music, both recordings, melodies, and often the percussion associated with pop music, also as elements in the work. This is partly because, they're as cultural objects, but also I kind of tend to use music as a way to punctuate. Often I'll use the kind of percussion you would associate with the girl groups, hand claps and finger clicks, and these are often used to kind of punctuate an edit, to mark where an edit will come, or to animate, perhaps give a kind of amplify the attitude or in a sense, the kind of construction of the personality through the narration, which I try to achieve. But also I will use music to connect things. So I'll use it sometimes as a kind of seductive, a sort of dizzy glue that allows me to move from one body of material to another. And to kind of sometimes to allow a really accelerated encounter with something. If I want to go through a whole load of material very quickly, I might use percussion or music in order to, in a sense, permit that. So I kind of use it almost as a formal element, apart from as being as an object in itself. I use it in the sense as if one were making a sculpture, as a kind of element that allows me to combine and connect. I also use some of the images of pop music, and most particularly the kinds of performances that pop music performers will do in accompanying the act of singing, and particularly the hand gestures that they will use to add emphasis to the lyrical content. And one of the things that I'm interested in respect to these gestures is the degree to which, in a way, they seem to allude to a different kind of content. The discrepancy there is between the gestures and often the sort of sweet or infantile content of pop music, and the gestures often will seem more grave, more ceremonial, and more sorrowful. Also, in one film in particular, I was interested to connect the gestures of pop music to the gestures that a series of witnesses made regarding a traumatic event that they had witnessed, and the point at which where it became difficult to explain something about an overwhelming experience, hand gestures were used to complete the communication. And I guess I'm interested in the relationship between this kind of use of the hand gesture by witnesses and the use that pop performers make of it, and this other content that seems to run through the pop performance. As you can see on screen, that this is the narrator speaking. So, in different pieces, the narration it has a particular graphic design, and it is expressed graphically and runs across the screen, and is used to ventriloquize documents and to kind of compose and to lead the viewer through this, in a sense, I'll make a script by drawing many documents together and cutting it up, or at least in the earlier works, the early videos I made, that's how I composed the script. So in many instances, the narration is ventriloquizing the words of the people you see or the documents that are being presented. But in the composition, my objective with the narrator is that the narrator leads you into a kind of location, and they're a kind of guide. I mean, they're absurd, they're often authoritarian, sometimes comic. I mean, I think occasionally I might have sympathy with them, one might have sympathy with them, but never entirely. So they're a kind of unreliable narrator, but they do quite assertively lead you through the work, and they tell you what things are, and then sometimes they tell you who they are. And I'm just going to show you now a clip from a film made in 2009 called User Group Disco, which is narrated by the workforce of the museum, or as they describe themselves, the human resource, that is the human resources of the museum. And in this, they basically begin to introduce the idea of the museum, but they introduce it by drawing on the management theories of Henry Mintzberg in order to describe the workforce and the kind of the managerial structure of the museum. And then we migrate to the aesthetic theories of Adorno in respect of referring to the authority of the curator in designating art. So I'm just going to show you that clip. Often in the course of the work, the chorus of narrators will declare here, 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 again and again. And as I said right at the beginning, this is one of the main things that in the composition of the work that I, in terms of determining what it is that the narrators do, I get them to figuratively construct a kind of location. And I'm going to talk a little bit through, in a sense, what I mean to do when the narrators repeatedly refer to the idea of here. One of the things that I'm after is that they're continually asserting the credibility of a here that they are in the process of figuratively constructing. So in the case of a film that I made in 2012, this might be a Gothic choir, which is kind of put together in the film by kind of editing together a series of diagrams, archival photographs, supplementing them with kind of fairly pedagogic CGI diagrams, and accompanying it with a kind of uncontested art historical series of terminologies, of descriptions of the choir, its layout, its constituent elements, so that by the time that takes about 7 minutes in the film, at the end of that 7 minutes, the viewer might hold in their mind the image of the Gothic choir, its constituent elements, and its layout. And I'm just going to show you how that happens. Okay, and I'm going to show you another clip now from a different film, the film A Restoration, in which the archival materials, the kind of archival remainders, if you like, of the excavation of Knossos, which are held in the Ashmolean Museum collection. Again, I do a similar thing of composing these things, organizing them, cutting between them, and accompanying them with a rather assertive narration, in a sense, constructing the figurative location, in this instance, of the city of Knossos. Also, in this instance, accompanied by music, rather sweet and persuasive music, that I try and kind of get a textured balance between sentiment and satire. So.
In the deepest parts of this labyrinth, we carve great, echoing caverns from which songs and alarms may carry. Along every path, to each chamber that we build. We start with silos and cysts, magazines and stores, and ready them for plenitude. We furnish them with great vessels, enough to feed a whole city. We fashion clay channels and chutes to draw water for drinking and to disperse effluent, and plumb great basins for bathing. We make dwellings with chambers for sleeping and eating, as well as lawns and arcades, sufficient for pleasure, fellowship, and trade. We elevate facades and grand winding staircases, extending up to 4 stories in height, serving all those grave, cool spaces of administration and it is to this end that we have built up, once more, the ancient ruin of Europe's first and oldest city, in satire and with love. We organize here a lovely, perverse refuge, and within its mazy spaces, we will gather and enclose all that we need.
So while the narrators are attempting to persuade you of the credibility of this figurative location constructed in the context of the video, one of the things that I'm kind of wanting to communicate or remind the viewer of, almost through the insistence of the narrators, of a set of other heres that exist in a kind of profoundly contested, impossible, textured relationship with the figurative here that they're constructing. I mean, first of all, I want to remind the viewer of the literal location of the site in which they are encountering the video. Both the specific location of the installation and its broader contexts, the museum itself and the broader context of, contemporary arts or museums more generally. In addition, I'm also wanting them to remember the specific context that might be associated with the materials. And at various points in the video, this may also be revealed. So the fact that these photographs exist within the Arthur Evans archive, within the Ashmolean Museum, that this diagram was produced by the Church of England. And so in a sense, I'm wanting to remind people of specific and generic locations, the Gothic choir as a kind of architecture, but also the idea of the Gothic choir as it exists within institutions such as the Church of England. So I'm always interested, in a sense, in not just a kind of literal architecture, or not just even a specific institution, but the idea of a here that brings to mind the notion of a realm of ideas, that when we enter into the here that the narrators are speaking about, one is conscious that we enter into multiple kind of interconnected realms of ideas, arguments of worlds or places. But there is also another here which I want to remind the viewer of, in a way almost through the belligerent insistence of the narrators that there is only this here, for it to become kind of increasingly discredited during the course of the film in the evidence of everything else. And that is the here of the digital location. And I'm going to now go into, in a sense, the other elements of the video that don't normally get seen in the museum presentation. So this is a still from the Woolworths Choir of 1979, and it's the first section, the first 7 minutes, as I spoke about, in which the Gothic choir is kind of figuratively narrated, set up during the first 7 minutes. And that photograph exists in a folder in my computer alongside many, many other photographs, which I took, as I described to you, in the reading room of the National Monuments Archive in Swindon. And then that folder sits in a folder with many, many other folders of many, many other, depicting many other aspects of Gothic architecture existing in that archive. And generally during the course of a project, I will gather huge amounts of material. Films are maybe 10 to 20 minutes long, but if there's moving image and I've made it, then generally they'll be like 40, 50, 60 hours. The first 7 minutes of Woolworths Choir of 1979, in the hard drive of my computer, there's over 1,000 photographs on which the video depends, which are the media, if you like, for the video. And now I'm going to talk you through very quickly, and I promise not too boringly, how video editing software works. So this up here is, so this is a Woolworths Choir of 1979, firstly. So this is the start of the film, this is the end of the film. This is what I see when I'm making it. This up here is a kind of shortcut to the file system of the computer. So all those folders full of all those photographs I can access up here. This up here is the monitor. So this is where I see the film as it plays, as I'm editing it. This section down here is sound. Below this double line here that you see, that's all sound. This section up here is image. And each of these tiny little bits on here are little image files. So there'll be photographs, pieces of text, bits of moving image that I have called up here, and when I call them up here, they appear here. I can choose the length of the clip, its duration. I can add any filters to it. I can make it black and white. I can saturate the colors. I can put a red tint on it. I can reverse it. I can put it upside down. I can negate it, and I often do those kinds of things. And then when I'm happy, I drag it down onto here. And one of the things to say in terms of how I develop the work is that I gather loads and loads of material, and when I start to edit, I don't have a script generally. I have loads and loads of materials that might end up in a script. I don't have a soundtrack. I may have different things that I think are going to be part of the soundtrack. I have loads of stuff, basically. I have loads of images. I have to have some sounds. I have some texts. And then during the course of composing the video, in a sense, during the course of editing it, the particular narrative is composed. So I don't storyboard, it doesn't exist in advance. And one of the things that happens is that I drag loads and loads of material onto the timeline. Now, if I go again to, one of the things that distinguishes how the software responds to sound files as compared to image files is that sound files are porous. Each of these little things here is a finger click or a hand clap. You can see there's loads of them. When the cursor runs across them, they're all audible. You can hear every single clap. And these audio tracks go down to about there. There's 67 on a Woolworths Choir of 1979. So I might have 15 different hand claps, and you'll hear them all. With image, you only see the top one. And what that... In a way, that's become really important to me, is that because I drag loads of material onto the timeline, and I cluster it, and I group it, and I start thinking about how I might connect it. And so I kind of end up with a different kind of means of organizing the complexity of the material, the extent of it, than I have in the file system. So kind of epistemologically, a slightly different system of organizing. So they end up in groups, kind of like almost like piles. I think of it like piles of clippings, like if I made collage, they're like piles of clippings on my desk. And I've kind of got them out of the drawer, if you like, and I've put them on the desk, and so I keep them there. But I bury them underneath the image that I'm most interested in. And I keep them there because I've got so many materials in the folders that if I lose it again, I'll lose whatever I thought was interesting. So it becomes this kind of sedimentary layer of decisions and memory and working through and responding to the complexity of the materials I have. But only the top one is visible. And during the whole course of developing the work, I'll continually change my mind, and the articulation of the piece will change. And then the idea of a conclusion of a piece is kind of when I'm more or less settled about which image sits on top of the pile and in a sense can express or speak for the material or the knowledge or whatever it is that has occasioned me to group them in that fashion. And I'm going to show a bit now this is the timeline for a restoration, a different software but the same thing. And so you can see here as the cursor runs over. And this is a section in the film where I wanted to kind of run through all of the materials. I want to kind of run across the whole collection of the Ashmolean and the Pitt Rivers, vast collections. And so what I decided to do is I'd find an artifact that might belong in every single kind of department of the museum. And I decided the artifact, the most likely one would be a drinking vessel. And so in this section of the film, we move through all of the drinking vessels in every collection and department of the Ashmolean. So we move through Western art and Eastern art, through anthropology, through ancient history, and so on. And as you can see, what I've basically done is stack them all up on the timeline. But in this instance, in the final edit, one gets to see everything, and I'll just show you that now.
So we gather them and bring them all here. We bring all the jugs and the flasks and every kind of cup for drinking. We move through each part of the collection to gather the beakers and tankards, goblets and glasses. Yes, we take them from antiquities and anthropology, from Eastern art and from Western. We bring them all together here, enough for everyone. For this great hectic gathering. Not one was made for a museum.
One of the reasons also that I chose the cup was that through the idea of the cup, I could draw the viewer back into the memory of a sensual encounter with this quotidian object, however extraordinary and rare or old these things in the museum might be, to remind them of the possibility of holding the cup in your hand and putting it to your lips, or the drinking vessel, but also the cup as the idea of as a means of intoxication, that the idea of getting all of the glasses out of all of the cabinets and all of the different departments of the museum so that everyone might drink out of them, and this kind of intoxicated, reckless, kind of imagined, embodied encounter with the materials of the museum was also a way in which I wanted to kind of speed through the collection, speed through all of its elements in this reckless way, and I'm kind of drawing the idea of the body and embodiment back into a kind of imaginary or kind of fugitive or remembered relationship in relation to these artifacts. And I think often the way in which I try and connect different materials in the digital composition on the timeline that I've described is to do with, in a sense, trying to draw them into a memory of the body or connecting them directly via a kind of bodily gesture. So I'm going to talk a little bit about about a film made in 2012 called A Woolworths Choir of 1979. Now, I've already shown you a bit of it. The first part of this film, first 7 minutes, is concerned with the Gothic choir. But the film is in 3 parts, and it wasn't always going to be in 3 parts, but the solution to the work came to be in 3 parts, came around a particular interest in how I might connect very different kinds of materials. And I found a way to connect them through a hand gesture, a kind of twisting wrist. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about that, about how the 3 parts of A Woolworths Choir of 1979, which are all very different and drawn from very different contexts and locations of very different materials, are connected by a gesture of a twisting wrist. Towards the end of the first section, the first 7 minutes, which is about Gothic architecture, the narrators are having constructed this architecture clearly designed as a kind of space of social relation, a space for people to occupy. They begin to search the evidence of the Gothic choir, which is full of images, for images of human life. And they find that on the lower parts of the Gothic choir, under the seats, where one can find profane, vulgar, comedic images on the misericords, and in the floor, where one finds sepulchral images of death. And there are loads and loads of different kinds of sepulchral effigies which are made at the same time as the Gothic choirs. But there's a certain group which manifests this extraordinary animation and are really, really quite amazing kind of artworks in which it's absolutely perfectly ambiguous as to whether the figure is falling into sleep or death. Or whether they are emerging out of sleep or death. And this kind of ambiguity between the states of awake and alertness or death and sleep is conveyed usually through a kind of twisting of the limb, most usually a twisting of the wrist, but also twisting of the legs. And I became really interested in the idea of the articulation of the twisting wrist as being this kind of pivot between these two states. And it really made a connection with me, particularly, I think, because I was, by coincidence, looking at some very different kind of material. I was looking at this performance of the Shangri-Las singing out in the streets, where the 2 twins in the Shangri-Las are kind of head cloaked, kind of upholstered perfectly, head to toe, in kind of black PVC, and they're standing very solemnly, and they repeatedly, all the way through this song, make this very strange, enigmatic gesture, which has nothing to do with the lyrical content of the song. And I was completely fascinated by this, and the way in which I tend to work is that I kind of work on lots of different things, and I don't know if they're going to connect. I kind of tend to be promiscuous. If I'm half interested in, I'll bring it in, and then I'll see if I can find a way to connect it, find a way for it to belong in the timeline. And so I was filming, I wasn't grabbing it off screen, I was filming it with my camera. So you also had the motion of my hand filming the monitor. And I was just gathering loads of this material. And I kind of came to this realization that I could connect this kind of photography of the Gothic choir with this dance of a 1950s American girl group through the idea of this wrist. And in that sense, I could move from one body of material, but also I could propose a kind of fantastical occupation, a population of the Gothic choir by these figures. At the same time as I kind of had this exciting idea about how I could connect, almost like one connects a sculpture, and I often think about the composition of these videos as being like bricolage sculptures, trying to make a thing on kind of almost, you know, I'm not worried about if it's ugly or not, I'm trying to get everything to hang on. And if I can just get it to hang on, then that's a kind of composition. So I was really interested in finding this connection and wondering whether it was going to work, and it reminded me of another set of images from news footage that I remembered from my childhood of a fatal fire in a Manchester department store where shop girls trapped in subsequently escaped, but before they escaped, they were trapped in the department store and they were waving out of the window. And on the news footage, there was repeated waving, and also they were throwing out of the window through the bars anything that was small enough to pass. So all of the small objects of the department store, cups and glasses, throwing them out, anything that could produce an alarm, that could alert people to them being there. And so I was reminded of this, which I had forgotten about, but which had made a real, an impression on me in the time, 1979. This was a time when Thatcher came to power, and I guess it was a moment where I became aware of a political world, a social world beyond the kind of confines of the family. I had a sense of what that world might be, and maybe seeing this, encountering this through the news was part of that realization. So I remembered it, and in that moment of remembering it, I decided that this was a way then that I could connect again from the gestures of the girl groups, these mournful gestures of the girl groups, to the gestures of the survivors and the witnesses of the Woolworths fire. And I'm just going to show you the two clips where those connections are made very quickly. So the chorus arrives, the way in which I think of it, the choir arrive, and are constituted by a composition in which many, many different performances are brought together in a single choreography through the hand gesture, and they seize the architectural vocabulary that has been used to describe the Gothic choir, and they use it to describe themselves. They say, we are trefoil, we are quatrefoil, we are threefold, we are fourfold, we are fivefold, we are choir. And then I'm now going to skip to the last part of the piece, where in a sense we see the choir, the chorus, connecting and again connecting through a choreography of hand gestures to the witnesses and survivors of the Woolworths fire in 1979. Okay, and now I'm finally going to talk about the work that is presently on show here called K, made 2 years ago. And this film, many of the themes of lamentation that are kind of first touched on perhaps in the film A Woolworths Choir of 1979 are extended into this work, but also some of the formal devices, the way in which maybe through a particular kind of gesture, and that gesture in its being bodily but also indicating a kind of twist or a kind of turn or a kind of flow becomes a means by which we might migrate between or connect very different kinds of material. It's a two-channel work, and it's one of the first multi-channel pieces that I've started to work in multiple channels in order to kind of further express something about the density of the different kinds of materials I'm drawing on, that there might be different places within the video in which different kinds of materials may appear. And at the start of the video, one is presented with a number of different kinds of materials which are apparently unconnected. The top left being a series of photographs, historic photographs of the sun taken between 1870 and 1945 on a daily basis, and we kind of run through a whole series of those images. Also a CGI animation of the weaving and the packaging of hosiery. This animation being based exactly upon technical drawings of the machinery used in a contemporary context for the manufacturing and packaging of hosiery. And also we see a number of female performers, and in particular, those performances are edited in such a way to draw attention to particular kind of bodily motions of swaying, but also gestures, and most particularly the hair of this pop performer, Crystal Gale, which is a really significant visual part of her performance and is kind of extraordinary. But also, interestingly again, is really, really inconsistent with the kind of content of her materials. It's rather kind of bland country. I mean, it's not even really country music. It's kind of middle-of-the-road, country-ish rock pop. But her performances are quite extraordinary simply because of this kind of strangely spectral kind of shadow of her body, this kind of hair which flows behind her. And in the course of the video, one of the things I should say that when I work on the videos, I don't know, as I said, I don't know what they're going to be when I'm editing them, but also I don't really know what it is I've done until about 2 years later. So it's about 2 years later when I sort of think, oh, I see, right, and kind of come to kind of understand or recognize things which actually would have been really useful at the time when I was finishing the work, but for which there is this kind of belated recognition. And I suppose one of the things looking back at this work now is a sense that the gestures, the bodily gestures, and particularly the use of the hair is used to kind of at certain points to propel or move the body across the screens, to combine the screens, and also to bring the different elements into a kind of sympathetic relationship. So the body seems to be responding to the sun, seems to be responding to the machinery, or vice versa. Also, what's different about this work and both of the works that will be on show here is that these are works in which the narrative is entirely fictional. So in the previous works, archival texts were ventriloquized or audio recordings were reproduced in order to compile a narration. So they were kind of cut up projects of drawing on different literatures. I mean, sometimes I'd kind of muck around with them a bit, use them a bit elastically, but basically I was drawing on archival materials. Whereas in the two pieces that will be on show here, the narrative is entirely composed, although composed after the experience of 10 years spent ventriloquizing institutional voices. So they're very, very influenced by that. And in K, the narrator, it's a group voice. They declare themselves as a group of professional mourners, and during the course of the narration acts to kind of stitch together the various elements into a kind of improbable but still just about sustainable imaginary relationship within the context of the fiction. And I'm just going to, there's another clip of Crystal Gale, and I'll just show you.
But at other moments, mourners would sway and lurch in somber elation, or with intoxicated, swoon in pleasure. Sometimes they show rage, and urgent alarm. Comic or slapstick devices, even pratfalls may also be used. But these are extremely difficult to nuance, and only the most experienced mourners will attempt them. We are the Crystals. We are a group of professional mourners. We generally work private funerals or memorials, but also serve minor state or civic events of sorrow or regret. We lead the mourning with gesture, with dance, with song, and with percussion. We crush cymbals. We clap hands. We snap fingers. Whilst we mainly attend events of memorialization, we are sometimes called upon for nuptials or to attend name and coming-of-age ceremonies. It is not unusual for us to contribute to trade fairs, to commercial launches for products, or to perform at the inauguration of prestigious institutional events, such as exhibitions or lectures. As sorrow has increasingly become contingent to all public and social affairs, any occasion of significance requires its proper acknowledgement. The dramatic range that is needed for professional mourning depends upon rare psychological aptitudes. Those can be developed as proficiencies through research and training, but only with singularity of purpose. The capacity for endurance, for tenacity is required. However, it must be admitted that there are other, less profound virtues that will contribute to success. Most clients prefer female mourners, and moreover, a certain idealization of feminine form contributes. Not overtly sexual, but a tense, austere physical shape is admired.
Okay, and I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.